you know.
Okay, I just started.
Okay, great.
Okay. All right, so welcome everyone. This is our first ever Ripple Tech Conversation series chat, and we're so happy that Mark MacCarthy from Georgetown Law is joining us. So the way this will work is I'll introduce Dr. MacCarthy and we'll chat a bit about the substance of platform power and regulation. Then we're also going to save some time to talk a little bit about sort of careers in technology law. Hopefully that's of particular interest to the students with us. And then we'll have Q&A, so you can use your Q&A function to ask your questions, and we'll save some time for those. And Carol, I think, yeah, you'll just let us know if for any reason we need to stop or pause. Okay, so Mark MacCarthy is currently a senior fellow at the Institute for Technology Law and Policy at Georgetown Law School. And he's also a senior policy fellow at the Center for Business and Public Policy at Georgetown's McDonough School of Business, a school which I love because it really sort of combines business and public policy. Kind of everything at Georgetown has a public policy component, which is kind of those of us who spend a lot of time in Washington see the world that way. And Mark's also a senior fellow at the Future of Privacy Forum, where he works on AI and data privacy projects, and that is really one of the leading think tanks and advocacy groups in this space. Mark has been at Georgetown University as an adjunct for 20 years, since the start of Georgetown's Center for Communications and Technology, which is, interesting. We're celebrating another 20-year anniversary tomorrow, and so as we think back to that world and that sort of year right after Y2K and sort of a very different tech landscape, Mark has been at the heart of it for a long time. He's teaching this, or last spring, I guess, you taught Mark governing emerging technologies, algorithms, AI, and robotics. We have a similar class at Rutgers Law, but we're really interested in expanding those offerings. Mark comes to this work in teaching, or he balances it with also his work in public policy advocacy, having served as Senior VP for Public Policy for Visa, and also heading up government affairs for ABC. And so one of the things we'll talk about is kind of, if we think about Visa as the financial sort of facilitation of transactions online as being sort of low down in the stack of enabling technologies that allow us to communicate, with ABC being at the top as a content provider. So welcome, Mark. We can get started. So I don't know if you want to kick us off with any comments of yours, and then we can sort of get right into talking about platform power.
So thanks very much, Ellen, and delighted to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to be the kickoff in this series of conversations. Just a couple of additional items about my background. One is, as of the beginning of this year, I joined the Brookings Institution as a non-resident senior fellow in their Center for Technology Governance, and the program that I teach in Georgetown is the Communications Culture and Technology program. It's been around for 20 plus years, and I've been teaching there for a little over 20. And this semester I'm teaching their privacy course and a course on competition policy and regulation for the tech industries. And next semester I'm planning on doing a course on content moderation for social media companies. And those three topics, they sort of form a Venn diagram of three intersecting circles of privacy, content moderation, and competition policy. And that set of issues forms the basis for a book that I'm working on for Brookings on the regulation of digital industries, where I focus on those three policy areas and how policymakers can best think about throwing a regulatory net around digital companies in respect of those three areas of policy concern.
Well, so that's a really good place to start is sort of the relationship of competition to, let's just take content moderation, and then we can also bring privacy in here. You and I are familiar with the FCC's, the Federal Communications Commission's long history of media regulation, common carrier regulation, telecoms regulation, where competition and media content were always seen as related. I think in the digital world, there's a lot of focus on competition policy, especially right now out of the Federal Trade Commission and the Justice Department in terms of mergers. And so there's a lot of energy behind sort of break them up, or the tech platforms are too big. But what would you say is the relationship between competition and some of our content concerns, content moderation concerns?
I think there is some concern about platform power, and because these companies, let's be clear who we're talking about. We have, let's just enumerate the industries. It's really social media, it's search, it's electronic commerce, it's mobile app infrastructure, the app stores and the browsers and so on that form the nucleus for the mobile app world. Those are the areas we're talking about. And what you see in each of those areas is a combination of two things, which gives the companies that dominate those particular services extraordinary power. In the first place, the services themselves are essential. A lot of people talk about how the services, social media, search, app stores, electronic commerce, how they're just not avoidable in today's world. And we really saw an illustration of that during the pandemic shutdown, where our heavy reliance on these services became apparent, and people who were unable to participate fully in those online worlds fell farther and farther behind. So the services are essential. We can't really do without them. And then add to that the fact that within each of these areas, within each of these lines of business, one or two companies dominates the market. So you have enormous concentration. You put those two problems together and you get a series of interconnected harms. A lot of ways of talking about the harms in the competition space, but because you don't have a lot of alternative providers, there's a real danger of abuse of dependent businesses. And so competition policy really has to figure out a way to prevent the holders of this kind of monopoly power from abusing it with respect to businesses that have no other way to reach their own customers than through the services of these digital companies. But it also creates these privacy invasions where the amount of information that's collected through these companies is truly amazing. One of my colleagues at Georgetown Law, Paul Ohm, wrote a wonderful law review article many years ago in which he coined the phrase "the database of ruin," which is, you're supposed to imagine this database in the sky which has all the information about your entire life, but now recorded in digital form, all your secrets, everything that you've ever done, everything you could possibly be embarrassed about, it's all there. And now imagine that database in the hands of your worst enemy. Well, you can only imagine what bad things might be done. You've got a pretty good imagination, but your worst enemy probably has an even bigger imagination. And so the risks of harm are enormous. Well, we don't quite have that with the amount of information that the digital companies are collecting, but we're getting there. And so there's a substantial set of privacy invasions and risk that's created. And then, of course, there's information disorder, which is where you want it to go. with this, and those present larger threats, to the effective operation of our political system and even our ability to manage crises like the COVID pandemic. I don't think that you create the problems of privacy or information disorder because you've got concentration, because you have a monopoly situation, but they make it worse. If you had, a gazillion Facebooks, then inability to moderate the content on one of those systems probably wouldn't be so much of a problem. But because Facebook really is the way in which many, many people reach the world and push out their information and gather others who feel in similar ways, because that's the platform where most of that is done, the concentration creates an additional problem. Flipped on its head, I don't think you can say to yourself, well, if only we had more competition, the problems would go away. I think surely having a little bit of extra competition might help, but it might not solve the problems. I mean, it might make it more difficult for Facebook to do content moderation if there are a whole lot of parlors out there in the world seeking to steal away their users as soon as they crack down hard. If you have more alternatives in the area of social media, you might have more problems in the area of privacy, not fewer ones, because now everyone's competing like crazy to serve the advertisers in the most detailed and targeted fashion. So I think you really have to think about this as separate policy areas, which require separate solutions if we're really going to get a handle on the different problems. You need something in the area of competition to protect dependent businesses, and you need something in the area of privacy to control the abuses that might take place there. And you need some measures in the area of content moderation to try to do something about controlling the information disorder in these systems. So that's my quick summary of the issues.
Yeah, I wanna pull on some of those threads. I mean, one of the things you've identified is that there are trade-offs here, and that and we may not know exactly what they are. And there's a sort of, Kara Swisher calls it, when Mark Zuckerberg talks about competition as a or sort of decentralized control as a solution to information disorder or privacy concerns. She says he will raise this Xi or me. Do you want me to be in control, or do you want China to be in control? Like, those are your choices. And most of us who are tech critics say that's a false choice. But there is something to that, right? And you put your finger on it when you said Parler, right? So that there's a, and I think what you're raising is it depends what problem we think is most important, and who is we, think is most important to solve. And so, if one is mostly concerned about extremist content, and we just don't want, and for extremists, you could substitute hate speech, or you could substitute misogynist speech or civil rights violating speech. If we want to sort of minimize that, then in a way, in some sense, just as in the old media world, you're sort of better off with large intermediaries who can be kind of disciplined either by the market or their shareholders or government. But, and I think this is the argument for decentralization. That's an argument I get for centralization. The argument I think for decentralization is assuming that the problem is not so much that this content exists. The problem is that sort of, ordinary users are radicalized by it, are affected by it, are sort of brought into conversation with things that used to be fringe and which they probably don't have, sort of endogenously don't have much interest in, but are kind of stirred up in ways. And there, you'd sort of be okay with that content going to Parler or wherever, and we've seen this with, the next generations of Parler, just because most people aren't going to follow it. So I'm wondering if you have any sort of reaction to that, and anything else about, I think there are also sort of similar threads we could pull on the privacy debate, right? Like, if you get things are decentralized, first of all, aren't they very easily reaggregated, through through Visa or through other kinds of data holders. So that's a comment. I'd love your reaction.
Yeah, so let me jump in on several of those things. First, on the Mark Zuckerberg's, it's China or me. I think we have, in a way, China's response to that in the form of what they've been doing over the past year, which is they too have been cracking down on their tech companies. This is not as widely understood in the United States as it should be, but outside of the area of information control, the Chinese government has largely left the tech sector alone. They've let them do what they want. Go make money. We'll even give you some extra subsidies to go forth and be successful there. But they didn't really crack down on any of the behavior in the Chinese market by the tech companies. And that led to a pretty undisciplined marketplace where cutthroat competition led to monopolies, and then monopoly abuses flourished. It led to increasing collection of information about the users of Chinese systems, which the Chinese users themselves were increasingly concerned about. And so the Chinese government said, we got to do something about that. They responded by cracking down on the tech companies, both in an antitrust way and in a privacy way. And so the idea that we can't crack down on the tech companies here in the United States because look at China. Well, if you look at China, they're taking the lead and cracking down on their tech companies. So I think that's a red herring, just as you said it was. On the way forward on competition, I do think it's largely a mirage that we can successfully introduce real competition into the different markets, into the search market or into the electronic commerce marketplace or into the social media marketplace. I think there are things that can be done to prevent the abuse of dependent businesses, but I don't think you're going to have 50 Facebooks, no matter what the antitrust authorities do. I don't think you're going to have another marketplace that rivals the size of Amazon's. I don't think you're going to be able to get a search engine that can outcompete Google. So the question is not how do you get new companies that can compete against the incumbents? The question is, how do you throw a regulatory net around companies that will have durable monopolies? And one thing you have to do is prevent them from abusing the businesses that depend on them. And that's a mission for antitrust. And then the other things I think you have to do is really put in place a decent set of constraints in the area of content moderation, which really affects the social media companies more than any of the others. And there, I do think we're faced with issues that have to do with our own legal system and our own constitutional structure that make the problem very, very difficult. If this were just like a regular externality problem, like dirty air or dirty water, we know what we do. You get a regulatory agency involved and you say, here's the permissible level of exposures. Or if it were worker safety and health, you'd say, I'm sorry, you can't expose workers to anything more than this many parts per million of silica. And we just mandate that the companies remedy the disorder, the externality. You can't do that when it's a matter of content moderation. I mean, in some jurisdictions, that's more possible than it is here. China is probably the extreme example of that, where they're not reluctant to use government power, to shape and form public discourse. But we don't do that, and the Constitution really does prevent us from moving in that direction. So you need something else to address that. And the easiest place to start is with remedies like transparency and open access to data, revealing the nature of the algorithms, how they're used, how they, as you were saying, Ellen, how they lead people down these rabbit holes of radicalization and extremism. And it may be that policymakers want more than that. They say, well, just being transparent doesn't solve the problem. I mean, and think back to the environmental externality problem. You know, you don't say to the companies, tell us how your smokestacks work, and then we'll talk about how to fix the problem, right? You say, just stop it. Policymakers want, in effect, to be able to tell the social media companies to just stop it. And of course, they run smack dab into the constitutional limits from the First Amendment when they try to do that. So first things first, is really low-hanging fruit. Let's get some transparency into the system. We don't have nearly enough right now, both at the level of individual disclosures to people whose material is being moderated, and disclosures to regulatory agencies to let them know what's going on the inside of these systems, what they do with their data, what they do with their algorithms. And once we've taken that step, we may be able to look around with a clearer vision and say, hey, there's something else we can do. I mean, here's a fix that might work. Maybe if we tell them to slow down the velocity of their retransmissions of harmful material, right, that could help. That seems to be the way the stuff spreads. Let's require them to put in place these constraints on velocity. And that could go a good long way towards resolving the distribution, the amplification of dangerous content. But we don't know enough yet to do that. We need to get inside these systems, have a good, clear look at them. And then we know a lot more. We'll know whether that's the kind of thing that might actually help.
Yeah, so two things I want to pick up on that you just talked about. My second point, but let's hold off on that, as you've used this a few times. We need to cast a net around these companies' problems. And I want to get to that because that sort of makes me wonder about to what extent these problems are infrastructural, and we should begin to think about kind of infrastructure regulation. I agree, it's not at the content layer. But before we get there, you know, so you were at ABC, and I'm an old broadcast lawyer, and many people, when they talk about what information disorder, they have in mind a sort of better days, right? When there were sort of responsible media companies that also were subject to defamation and also were liability and also were subject to certain kinds of FCC regulations. And these forces, both civil liability and regulatory liability, kind of created some moral hazard and some sense of responsibility. We also know that to the extent that that ever existed, those better days, I think they did, although they also came with certain exclusionary tendencies, and they were, you know, there was a very kind of narrow range, right, of content that was offered. But to the extent that that existed, that too was a product of business imperatives. And so we know the history of 20th century media, that it grows out of sort of mass advertising, and it's in the interest of the large media companies to essentially offer things that are broadly appealing to the broad middle. And so it kind of reaffirms and strengthens and bolsters a kind of moderation in the populace. And there are always extremes, but they are not really reflected in kind of mainstream media. And so that's this story about media and about its relationship to business practices and advertising practices. And then the story, when we jump to digital media, the story goes, and I've written about this also, that, you know, it's the business model. It's not the content is downstream of the business model. And the business model is that we have micro-targeted advertising, which is an engagement, digital media engagement models, which basically want to keep people on platform as long as possible. And fortunately or unfortunately, the way we human animals work is we are more excited by things that make us angry, by things that sort of excite us, and not by like the moderate kind of broccoli, you know, that might be good for our conversation. You know, so moderate broccoli, that's mixed metaphor, but you know, the less tasty stuff. So if you're with me so far, the way that story usually ends on sort of the regulatory proposal front is regulators, and totally accepting everything you said about the content layer and the constitutional guardrails, and that these are not ordinary externalities. This is not, media is not just a toaster with pictures, right? It has special constitutional salience. And so the way that story usually ends is, therefore, regulators, you need to get at the business model and create incentives for more healthful business models. Now, transparency and some of the regulatory interventions you discussed are usually part of that conversation. Another piece that's sometimes part of that conversation is maybe, and I think Maryland tried this and it was, I think, struck down in the courts, but to tax advertising, or to tax the business model. And, or we could, antitrust is a piece of this too, or competition law, even if it's ex-ante regulatory competition rules that create more space for different kinds of business models to operate. So I'm just wondering if you have views about the business model as being a source of the information disorder.
Yeah, I think it. I think the problem is broader than the business model. It's sort of almost the technological affordances of the new social media platform. I mean, think about not the business model of television or radio, but what it is that they've got. They've got a limited amount of time and airspace in which to put stuff out. So their major problem is, what do we put in there, right? And so they're always making a judgment. Is this something that deserves to get onto my scarce platform? Think about the social media companies now. They don't have that kind of scarcity problem. They don't have to think, am I going to let this thing on my system? Yes or no? Their question is quite different. Their question is this thing so dangerous that I want to keep it off? And so they really have a different function. And that's good, because what it does is overcome the problem of monoculture, which you described earlier, which is, if you can only fit a few things onto your system, you're going to find the things that are the most popular, because that's the way you can reach the largest audience. But if you don't have a scarcity problem, then you want to get the long tail. You want to get everybody, not just the most mainstream perspective or the most mainstream point of view. You want to get the edges, because if you serve them too, you provide a much larger group of people that you can think of as your audience. So keeping stuff out is the job for the social media companies. And the question is, what are the guardrails that they live under? And I know it's hard to believe now, but initially they didn't really think they had any guardrails. I mean, they really thought that this was a marketplace of ideas and that all they had to do is be a passive platform, and the problem would take care of itself. But over time, they recognized that they really didn't even have a business unless they engaged in content moderation. If these systems turned into these kind of ugly cesspools where everybody was yelling at each other and it was filled with pornography, obscenity, and hate speech, then no one would want to be there. They go watch television or do something else. You don't have to be on social media. And so content moderation grew up as a business necessity. But once again, the perspective was, how do we keep people engaged, but keep the place safe enough so that we have a community where people actually want to be engaged rather than fleeing in horror at what they see before them. So I do think the problem is broader. It's not so much that they've created an advertising model that creates the problem. It's that they've got a lack of scarcity that gives them a different way of approaching the problem. And then the second thing that social media does, which is an intrinsic part of what the services that they're providing, is that they use their ability to interact with and observe their users to provide a service that otherwise wouldn't be available. They can find what people are interested in and match people up with each other in ways that a passive audience in the in broadcasting could never do as effectively. So they can do this for, stamp collectors are all around the world. They can find the interest that someone has as a stamp collector and say, you might not know it, but Fred over here has got an interest in stamp collecting too. And suddenly you're connected to a group of stamp collectors. Well, if you can do that for stamp collectors, you can do it for white nationalists too. And so the information disorder flows directly from this personalization aspect of social media and from the fact that they have no need to look at the content beforehand to say, do I want you on there, yes or no, because I don't have enough room in my system and I have to be selective. You put those two together, you're going to have an information disorder problem, even if the stuff wasn't paid for by advertising. Now, does it make it worse if you've got advertising? Of course, because the need to collect large volumes of information about people goes way beyond what you need for personalization of service. You have to create profiles that enable advertisers to target people much more accurately than they otherwise could. And there's no finite limit to the personalization that's needed for advertising. The more detailed you can get, the better. If you could do one-on-one advertising, even better. So the personalization is one force that creates the problem. It's exacerbated by advertising. I don't think if you banned advertising tomorrow, you would still have the problem and you would have to do something about it. So you can't say, ban advertising, walk away, problem solved. You still need a regulatory net to make sure that the content moderation function is done properly.
Well, I'm glad we've gotten to the regulatory net because I want to get to that. And one of the things that I hear you saying, and I think, sometimes people say, look, whenever there's new tech, there's some period of sorting out. And whether it's the Gutenberg Bible or whether it was radio broadcasting, the beginning of the 20th century, and we're just in that period. And everything you just said sort of supports the idea that you're not going to have sort of targeted bans, whether it's bans on targeted advertising or significant constraints on that practice, or other kinds of practices. Another one that we haven't talked about, sort of the technical affordances of quantification of reaction, right? So we know from research, right, that likes and favorites, even replies, retweets, quote tweets, that all of those technical affordances tend to favor, sort of more extreme, more destructive, less civil conversation. It could lead someone, and it has led the platforms to experiment with, at least Twitter has experimented with kind of hiding some of those or changing some of those technical affordances. But I think if I understand you properly, those things are going to be around the margins. So that should lead us to, instead of sort of trying to unwind what's happening, to hasten the day when we are sort of have adjusted to this. And there's another thing that we're not going to have time to talk about is kind of media literacy and the demand side of the information disorder. But let's talk about that regulatory net. And I'm curious to know, other than obviously there's a big competition component there. There's also, I think I heard you say, there's sort of data access and data sharing is, to some extent, we can think of data as being infrastructural, right? And that there's a way in which one of the reasons why competition is difficult here is that you function better. First of all, there are network effects, but also you function better when you have access to big data, the way some of these companies do, the way Visa does, right? And so, when we think about this net, other than competition and sort of, or ex-ante competition related rules, what else are we talking about, and how does it bear on data access?
So there are lots of different ways to think about data sharing, data access, but when I think of them, I think of those things as tools to promote competition. So you want to be able to get another Facebook. What's the best way to do that? Well, you have network effects. You've got this huge barrier to change, because if you leave Facebook, you want to be able to take your network with you. You want to take all your information with you and still not be a part of the Facebook network. And so a solution like data portability grows up, where you say to the user, you can take all your information and wander off to another provider, and you've got all the stuff you ever had back at Facebook. And so that gives the competitor a better chance of being able to lure you away from the incumbent social media company. Or for Google, I mean, there's an argument that there's scale effects in data with the accuracy of search. They may run out at a certain point, but certainly, at least to some level, they're there. So why not jumpstart competition in search by taking all the data that Google has accumulated and just make it available to someone else to train their search algorithm? And then we'd have two search algorithms, both bleeding off of the same set of data. In effect, you treat the data as a kind of common resource to be used by a number of different providers, not just Google. But I see that as an attempt to jumpstart competition. You could also think of data portability as a kind of privacy measure, and that's the way it's been implemented in GDPR and the California Privacy Act. But its primary function in my mind is to promote competition. So I don't see data sharing as a fix really to these other issues, certainly not as a fix to information disorder. In fact, it may wind up being a threat to information control in a good way. I mean, think about one of the pro-competition measures that is commonly talked about, which is interoperability. So not only can you take your data with you, but in sort of a real time, you can interact with people on other social media platforms. It's similar to the telecommunications world, where companies had to interconnect their telecom systems in order to complete telephone calls. Well, how's Facebook now supposed to control its own platform? Someone can wander off to Parler, sit there and lob material back into Facebook users, and Facebook has limited ability to control that kind of thing. So you've produced a new competitive alternative by this interoperability trick, but you've also made it harder for a company to engage in good content moderation.
Yeah, that very much reminds me of the end-to-end encryption discussion, right? Where you've got a sort of fix for privacy, but you've made responsible content moderation much more difficult. So let me, before we get to sort of the personal and sort of professional story of yours, I did want to, since you were at Visa, and since we've just had this really fascinating controversy about Just Fans, does a lot more than pornography, but it has a lot of pornography on it. And so my understanding is that there were a number of payment providers that ceased service to Just Fans because they were being pressured, or they organically did not want to be involved with pornography. And so you have, sort of a decision fairly low down in the infrastructure stack to choke off the ability of this platform to function. We saw it earlier a couple of years ago with Cloudflare ceasing service to 8chan and 4chan. And so the question is, where most of the attention has been at the top, the application layer, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube for their content moderation. But of course, as you go down the stack and you get, in some ways, although at the top of the stack, we don't have that many competitors we've just talked about, but you go down the stack, you get more and more power. It's a blunter and blunter instrument. As sort of, we know these are private companies that can make their own choices. They are not considered, again, using this term infrastructure, they're not considered like the railroads, they're not common carriers, although in some sense, they behave that way because there are very few of them and you sort of need to resort to them. And, this also relates to my question about data in this world where data, and I will not say data is the new oil, but I will say that data data is kind of an infrastructural piece to operate any of these businesses. These companies that control data or control payment systems do have a lot of power. And so what's your opinion about whether it's a good idea for them to be involved in sort of content-based decisions, or whether they should remain neutral platforms?
Yeah, I actually had some direct experience with that at Visa when I got there. Visa was the subject of some unpleasant publicity from the business press. There were stories that said Visa, payment card of choice for child pornographers, and Visa spent several $billion pumping up its brand as the place where it was everywhere you want to be. But one place they didn't want to be was in the child pornography business. And so the question is, what do we do about that? And the company pretty quickly realized that it had to, I mean, they had a clause in their contract which said you can't use the payment cards for illegal transactions. And it also had a clause that said you can't use the payment cards in ways that cause brand damage. So they put that in their contracts for their users. And so they used both of those to slowly but surely try to close down on child pornography, which they did by searching the dark web and finding the places where the Visa signs were in place, and then finding the bank, which was providing them with the merchant services, and saying to the bank, you've got a day to get rid of this customer or we're shutting you off.
And that was, so that CSAN material is illegal, right? So that's one cut at it. Yeah.
Right. And so they did that, and they did the same thing in internet gambling, because internet gambling is illegal in some jurisdictions and legal in others. They invented a very a nuanced way of telling the difference between an online gambling transaction that took place in the UK or in Aruba, and an internet gambling transaction that took place in the United States. And they reached out and blocked the ones that were illegal in the United States, which was then codified into US law by a piece of legislation passed in 2005. So the idea that you'd step forward and use your payment system in ways that would take action against illegal transactions, that was actually a step for them, because they didn't want to affirmatively do that. If someone directed their attention to it, they might react to it, but affirmatively reaching out and putting in place a system to filter their system for that kind of material was new to them. And then, just as the lawyers worried, they kept saying, we can't do this, it's a slippery slope. Sooner or later, the slippery slope started to really act. And after I had left, they were heavily involved in the WikiLeaks incident back in 2008 or 9, I think it was, when WikiLeaks was at that point still a favorite on the progressive world, and because they were taking information from government and making it available to the public. And they found a cache of material that they leaked from US files that they thought was important for the public to know, and many of the national security people thought was a threat to national security and the lives of US agents. And the Visa, MasterCard, and everybody associated with WikiLeaks were immediately put under government pressure to cut contacts with the WikiLeaks founder and the whole organization, which they caved to. I mean, they just said, yeah, we'll do it. PayPal did it, Visa did it, MasterCard did it. Amazon cut off their web services so they couldn't use Amazon. It was all done via informal government pressure. And this prompted, the New York Times, which had previously been saying, why aren't these people being more responsible about making sure their system is clean of bad behavior? It prompted the New York Times to say, what if a bank decides that they don't like my editorials and starts taking away my ability to engage in banking services? I mean, these people shouldn't be allowed to make these kind of content judgments. But as you point out, given the way our system is set up, they're perfectly within their legal rights to do that. American Express, for example, for years and years and years, did not want anything to do with pornography of any kind, and it was their choice not to do business with those merchants. This wasn't child pornography. This is the regular, legal pornography industry. And they said, we don't want the American Express card, which is a top of the line brand, to be associated with merchants of that kind. And they made a similar judgment about gambling merchants. So it's it really is a matter for the discretion of the companies at this point. My own instinct is that if a company is well situated to do something about the problem, they can find out who some bad actors are, and they can effectively take action against them, then they probably should look carefully at whether they should do it. And my further instinct is that because these companies live in a world where the concerns go beyond what's illegal, they're going to have to move into areas where they're dealing with content or business activity that is perfectly legal, but they still don't want to have anything to do with.
Right.
And if they really are in a position where they can do something about that, they're going to have to make those kind of judgments about whether they'll be willing to do it. And that means taking the heat to be engaged in substantive political decisions and making an argument for why in this case, it was important to do it. And in that case, it wasn't. Companies don't want to be in that circumstance. They'd rather have someone else tell them to do it. But if they're going to provide a payment system or a social media network, that comes with the territory. They have to be willing to engage in that kind of dialogue and discussion. And I do not think they can sit back and say, I'm just a platform. I don't have to worry about that. I'm sorry. The time for that kind of passive posture, I think, is way past.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. And we're out of time, but I just wanted to give you the last word. And if you have any thoughts for our students, I don't know quite how to formulate the question. You can ask, you can say whatever you want, but I'm just curious if you would have advice about, what are the areas of tech law that you think are most fruitful, most interesting for them to pursue, most available for them to pursue?
So I jumped around a lot too in my career. And I think maybe the best piece of advice is don't think that the first place you land after you leave school is going to be the last thing you're ever going to do in your life. I worked in a congressional committee for 8 years. I was with ABC for another 8. I worked for a public policy consulting firm. I worked for Visa. I finished up my commercial career as the vice president, senior vice president for public policy at a technology trade association. And now I'm in the academic world and the think tank world, writing about regulation. You'll have a lot of opportunity to explore different career paths after you come out of school. And the one thing that seems to me to be presenting the most opportunity is it might very well be government work or work in the making of public policy. For the first time in maybe 40 years, I think we're in a situation where people think that government might be the solution to our problems. We've had 40 years of retrenchment in the idea of government being a positive force in society. I think we're in a situation right now where throwing a regulatory net around tech companies is on the agenda. Possibly the most frustrating thing that you might run into if you move in that direction is the miserable state of legislative paralysis and ultra-partisanship that seems to block forward movement in the regulatory and legislative area. But I do think the door is open on a bipartisan basis for discussions about regulation. And as I say, I think that's the first time in about 40 years that that's been something that's available. So positions in that area, in the government itself, in advocacy groups, in think tanks, I think would be a good place to think about beginning your career when you come out of school.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mark MacCarthy. Thanks for joining us and giving us such a rich discussion. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thanks a lot. Take care.
Bye.